Welcome back to class. We are going to jump right into our work text on page 17, chapter 2 of your work text, which deals with macro planning the budget. And as we jump right in with macro planning the budget, one question pops up, and that's the question that I get asked quite often when someone is frustrated or they're just brand new to ministry, and that's, how do I plan a yearly youth ministry calendar? It can be a daunting task when you look at it, and so we end up spending our time with everything that we think is going to hit us in the next 30 to 90 days, and we miss out on some incredible opportunities, and we also counterproduce or we counteract our intentions to be able to shepherd in youth ministry and not just be an activity planner. If you remember one of the axioms that we discussed in one of the first video sessions, it said that earlier in your work text that if you plan now, you pastor later. And if we want to commit to a shepherding model of youth ministry, in that we are more concerned about transformational discipleship and do our students in the end love Jesus more, or were they just busy, or did they just learn a bunch of facts? We've got to plan, and you've got to think about a yearly youth ministry calendar. And so as we begin to tackle this part of your project, I know that it's probably got you swimming in details, and it's very tedious work, but it's critical that you do this work because it frees you up to be able to do the ministry that you're called to do. When we think about macro planning the process, your calendars must be born out of your own philosophy of ministry. In other words, you can't start just doing things on a calendar, placing items on a calendar just because you've heard that's what you should do in youth ministry. You need to make sure that you're very strategic in that the things on your calendar are connected and tied to your philosophy. Second is that it's got to be bathed in prayer. I mean, we began this whole class talking about the crucial force of planning and programming in youth ministry is prayer. We looked at the statement by E.M. Bounds that God doesn't work through plans and machines, but he works through people. The Spirit works through people, and your calendar's got to be bathed in prayer. Third is that it needs to be based and at least informed and done with the church calendar in mind. In other words, you can't just go rogue with your calendar. You got to think about the complete church. In fact, that's one of the things that has gotten youth ministry and youth pastors in trouble in the past, is that we try to do our own thing and go rogue and create our own little culture within the church. We need to be a part of the total body of the Christ and the whole church there. So it's really critical that you think about the whole church calendar. Now, as you move on through, let's think about what your programming year actually looks like. Every church and community may vary to some degree based on several different factors. One of the things to think about is a lot of churches like to run their programming year on their fiscal calendar. Some fiscal calendars run July 1 through June 30. Others may run from August 1 to July 30. Here at the seminary, that's how our calendar operates, from August 1 to July 30. I don't know very many churches that do it that way. I have served in a church before that did their fiscal year was based on July 1 through June 30, and I actually enjoyed that because I was able to position the school year within that fiscal budget. And so when I would plan out my budget, school obviously would start for most of us, and some of us it will start in September, but for most of us it begins in August. And so we were able to fit August through June would be our school year for our students. And so our fiscal year matched up with that, so it was very helpful. When your fiscal year begins with that, you've got more of a school year layout, sometimes September 1 through August 31st, and it fits very well. And then sometimes you have a calendar year budget, which many of you do have, and I think a lot of churches probably fall into this category, where it's January 1 to December 31. And there's some legitimate reasons for that fiscally, because you're in one taxable year, and it helps with payroll and other things. But honestly, it can be very difficult in planning your budget, and you're waiting for January, you're getting to the end of your year, and then looking for opportunities to try to do things on a low budget towards the end of the year, as people, maybe your budget is a little bit behind and you're waiting for others to give and donate, or you just have to really trim out some things. And so it's not my favorite layout for the programming year, but sometimes that's what you have. And so it's not really worth figuring out or trying to complain about it. Just let's get the strategy in place so we can work with it. Let's talk about how we do this and how we approach this. One of the things in your notes that you'll see is really critical, and I really appreciate this. Is that there's we talk about how do we get to the calendar and begin planning the program year. And one of the things that I like to do is conduct a ministry forecast. In other words, you're going to watch the news at 6 o'clock, and you're going to try to figure out what the week holds on a Sunday night. for weather. You're looking at events and activities and things that you're engaged in. And you want to know what the weather's going to be like. And so you're going to watch a weatherman on the news who's going to give you a forecast for the week. And when he gives you that forecast for the week, it helps you either adjust or prepare or maybe do some things differently. And it's very similar in youth ministry when we talk about ministry forecasting. Before we lay out the calendar and really get into the details of that, we want to do some forecasting in ministry. And to do the forecasting in ministry, one of the things that is very important is that we begin with a climate report. So before you can forecast, you've got to develop your climate report, and that climate report should include the present conditions. And so we ask some significant questions that help us in getting to this forecast. So the first thing we ask is simply, you can see it right there in your work text, what is God doing in our community? You may say, well, God's not really active in our community. Now, I know you really don't believe that. It may not seem like God is doing a lot, but if you look, what is God doing? Maybe God has your community in a place where it's very dry. And maybe God's got your community in a place where they're very sensitive to serving and the needs of others. They may not know Him, but they care about their people in the community in very tangible ways. And figure out what God is doing in your community. Then ask the question, what is the spiritual condition of our community right now? And by spiritual condition, of course, we mean what is the makeup of those who are engaged in local churches, as well as those who are not just engaged in local churches, but are actively involved in the Great Commission. But I'm also asking the question, what is the spiritual condition of our community right now, in a sense that I want to know, are they sensitive to spiritual things? Are they interested in that facet of who we are as human beings? And so we ask that question. Third question that we need to ask is, what is God doing in our church? And then we follow that up with, what is the spiritual condition of our church? It's critical that you pray through these and you ask these questions, maybe with some of your volunteers. And this could be very revealing to the condition of your church when you ask your volunteers, just what is God doing in our church? What is the overall spiritual condition, the climate report of our church? And lastly, there's two questions. What is God doing in our youth department? I mean, what's been happening in the lives of students and otherwise, in the ministries that we engage in, and what is the spiritual condition of our students and our teenagers right now? These are several key questions. These 6 questions are critical because they help us really see how we need to approach the calendar. I met with someone just recently, in fact today, and we were doing some consulting and some evaluation of a new position that he's in. And as we were talking about the ministry that he's just stepped into to engage in, that there are key elements to the weekly ministry of that student ministry, and it's probably very familiar to most of us. And that is simply that there is a Sunday morning. They do have a Sunday night program for adults, and so they have activities for students when the adults come together for that Sunday night program. And then there's a Wednesday night program. And so what we see there is a very traditional setup. And so what I told him was simply that he needs to look at every program in light of not just what a youth ministry should do, but what is God really doing with the students in his student ministry right now, and then begin to focus those programs towards the spiritual condition of the teenagers right now. And so it's critical that you just don't do it robotically, but you actually think about the spiritual condition of your ministry and where you need to take that right now. So those are some questions, 6 questions. Now I throw in a 7th question. The 7th question is simply that what are we presently doing to fulfill the church's mission and to carry out the mandates in our own department? Because you can't just do it in a siloed approach where you do youth ministry in a sense that you think that the rest of the church can continue to operate and the student ministry is just going to have their little party over off to the side. It may seem that way to some people, but the overall purposes of what you're doing have to fit within the overall mandates and the mission of the whole church, not just the student ministry. So once you begin that climate report, and as we're working through this ministry forecast and we talk about what's going on right now, we answer those questions and do a quick climate report. Then we move on to the ministry forecast, and we really start to get really into some fun things, and that is simply that we start looking at the future possibilities. And so we ask several questions here, and there's 4 key questions that you can see there in your work text. One is, where might God be taking our community spiritually in the next 12 months? Think about that. It may be a good thing just to just to pause after we reveal these questions, and maybe you should pray about it. Maybe you should think about these. Just let them marinate a little bit on your heart. Where might God be taking our church spiritually in the next 12 months? Where might God be taking our student ministry spiritually in the next 12 months? And then the final question is, what programming should we consider to carry out the mission and mandates during the next 12 months? And I love this process because it really helps us really get in touch with the spiritual condition of our student ministry and where God has taken us. And so it helps us develop this ministry forecast. So we don't approach our calendar from a perspective and a strategy of just trying to add things to it. We approach our calendar based on what we sense God is doing and what we see happening in the lives of the people around us that are serving in the ministry and that are a part of that ministry. Well, once we get through the ministry forecast, now comes the really fun part. I enjoy this part. And this is where we step into what I call brainstorming. Now, you know what brainstorming is. This isn't rocket science, and so I don't have to explain what brainstorming is about. But it's as simply as the term the term describes itself. It's sitting down and just letting ideas flood through and working through those ideas to brainstorm ideas so you can come up with a grocery list or a whole bag of things that you're going to discuss and talk about with your volunteers as you look to plan your ministry calendar. And so as we do that, we start with brainstorming. I want to throw this quote up there for you by Craig McNair Wilson from the book Disney Imagineering. It's a really cool book. It's a really thin book. It's an easy read, and you might want to get on Amazon or Kindle or your Nook and download it. Process of dreaming up unique ideas and then thinking them into the reality. Now, if you've ever been to Disney, you know that it's a magical place to go to Disney World, and in that place, there's all kinds of creative things that have been put there in that amusement park, all the way back, dating back from when Walt Disney first imagined it himself. And one of the things that Walt said when they opened up Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida, he wasn't actually there. His wife was there, and actually another Walter Cronkite was there, the old CBS anchorman. And he looked at Mrs. Disney and he said, Mrs. Disney, if only Walt could have been here to see this today. You know what she said? Maybe you've heard this before. She said, if Walt had never seen it, we would not be seeing it today. In other words, it's when we brainstorm, we begin to imagine things that are so crazy sometimes, but they actually just might be able to be brought into reality and be effective in accomplishing the mission of where God might be taking our church and our student ministry in the future. And so I appreciate that, the process of dreaming up unique ideas and then thinking them into reality. When we think about brainstorming, there's before we get into some of the details of the brainstorming, I'm going to walk you through 10 steps of laying out the calendar in just a second. But before we get there, I want to look at this brainstorming component. And the first thing is environment. What does it look like? I mean, when you set up the brainstorming session, what does it look like, honestly? What we're going to deal with, you got to be careful in that environment to make sure you set it up so it facilitates the opportunity to be creative. I'm not talking about, putting games or nothing in there, but I'm thinking about paper on the wall. You can have pads everywhere. You need dry erase boards in there. You need opportunity to have wireless communication and a network connection there. So if you need to get on your iPads or your phones or your computers, you can look up things as you think about names and ideas, and maybe even investigate what some other student ministries have done that may fit exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so we have to be careful and be intentional about the environment. How many people do you need? Well, this can be kind of crazy. A lot of people want to be a part of that, but what you need to do is make sure you whittle it down to about 5 to 7 people. You need an odd number. It prevents deadlock when you're talking through things. But if you get too many people in there, you're never going to get anything done. So really about 5 to 7 people. Do it off-site from the group's normal routine. Get them out of the normal routine. Maybe you need to go and find a retreat center, or maybe it's a meeting place at a restaurant that'll give you a room for several hours, or maybe you take a retreat and go do this. But the brainstorming is you need to get off-site from the normal routine. It needs to be a casual atmosphere, to where one that you can relax and you can let the creativity just flow. There needs to be room for everybody to move around, and you need to have access to refreshments. And then you got to have the supplies that I mentioned before, different kinds of butcher paper or post-it notes and markers, 3x5 cards, tape, bulletin boards, dry erase boards, and internet and video screens, and everything that you can put in there that could be used in that process. What do we do with brainstorming? Well, there's two main sessions in the brainstorming. There's several things that we're going to look at. One is, what is our goal for brainstorming? The first off, our goal is to have a non-linear free flow of ideas. In other words, it doesn't mean that one links to the other. It's a time right off the bat that you help everybody understand we're going to have a lot of ideas that may not connect to each other, and we're going to try to direct this in as we look at specific calendar items and ideas and try to keep it flowing, but it doesn't have to have this linear movement to the ideas. A large number of ideas. You're going to have boards full of ideas that eventually a lot of those may be just, you may take a picture of them and file it on a PDF, or you may end up erasing a lot of that. You're going to have some wild ideas, bigger than you're comfortable with, that stretches you, that seem illogical, but also raises some question marks about why or how or if or when or should we. And so that's the goal, is to really push you a little bit out of that comfort zone during that thing. Second, there's a golden rule to brainstorming, okay? And you can see it right there in your work text. The golden rule is that there are no bad ideas. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no that you're not going to have ideas that you're never going to use. I'm just saying, when you're brainstorming, you got to make sure you keep the free flow. When you start labeling things as bad ideas, you end up running into roadblocks with those that you're leading. Three, there's the methods. What are the methods? And I list these three, and I love these things, and I use these all the time. There's yes and. We call it plussing, which equals someone, and this is my forte. I love piggybacking and plussing because I am not the greatest at developing ideas, but I love capitalizing and building upon ideas. And so plussing is when you add an idea to someone else's idea. And then piggybacking is when you're adding ideas unrelated or unconnected. And so you may hear something and someone suggests something, you think, well, I've got an idea. It doesn't really relate to that, but that made me think of this. And then there's the third category, which is it's not a real easy terminology, but it's just antimorphism. And you put yourself in the place of the event as a person. Okay, if the Saturday night rally was a 16-year-old Louisville teenager, what would it look like or be like? Okay, and that's what brainstorming is really about. Number 4, that's session 1 for brainstorming and creative thinking. And then number 4 of session 1 is we got to be careful of some dangers. There are obviously some dangers in this because you're just letting the ideas flow. But there's really a couple of key things. One is wimping. You got to be careful. You got your people who are proverbially negative, and they throw out negative comments on someone else's idea instead of helping to encourage those things or just letting the person say it and then move on. They want to make sure that person understands that was not a good idea. They would be your candidates for the president of the Cold Water Committee in any church. Well, you got to be careful. You got to make sure you cut off the wimping effect. And then there's blocking, where someone stops someone else's idea. Where, in other words, they hear the idea and they just say, you know what, that's never going to happen. It costs too much money. It's just crazy to do. It doesn't even fit with what we're trying to do. Brainstorming is not about determining what's good or bad. It's to let the ideas flow. And then lastly, in session 1 of creative thinking, is the process. How do you do this? You're thinking, man, we're just going to throw out ideas. Well, actually, there is a process. And the process is you find a specific topic, then you begin to generate ideas and record them in whatever way, and you must use plussing and piggybacking to build on those ideas. Well, that's session 1, creative thinking. Some additional insight into what you do, we get to session 2 of critical thinking, and with that, we find these 5 things, and I'll leave this here. This is where you narrow your selection and you decide on a direction. So when you have all these ideas that have been produced, when you get to the critical thinking part, this is when you start saying, I'm going to scratch that one, we're going to move that to a different part of the board or a different piece of paper, and we're going to begin to collect all of these other ideas under our Wednesday small group ministry. Okay, which ideas would fit there? Group the ideas by category. If you have cards, you can put them by category. If you've used big 16 by 20 post-it paper on the walls. Then turn ideas into production schedules, which you are working on for your project. Develop a mythology of the event. In other words, describe what the program or that event would look like, somewhat of a narrative. And then group all your unused ideas, file them away. If you're using big dry erase boards or poster paper or post-it notes, or take your camera and take a picture of that and file it away somewhere. And that's the session 2. So there's 2 sessions to brainstorming. One is creative thinking, and then the second one is critical thinking. So the whole point of chapter 2 is macro planning the calendar. So let's bring this down to something that we can really respond to, and that we can really use. Let's look at macro planning the calendar in 10 steps. Before I get to step 1, we got to make sure you understand, when do you do this? Okay, this session or retreat should be held months before the year, i.e., meet in March to plan August through July. I would encourage you to meet about 3 months out. So you should, when you have this meeting to plan your calendar, you should be somewhere in that 15 to 18 month range of the coming, the end of that next year that you're planning. So if you're planning a year, 2012, if you were doing 2013 and August through July, then you're going to want to make sure you have this retreat and planning session somewhere in February, early March to do that. Step 1, let's go through these quickly. Step 1, they're right there in your notes. Step 1, as we begin this process, we start to look at this. We got to make sure that we have the right people there. Sorry about that. We got to make sure we have the right people. Who are the key people that need to attend the session or the retreat? You could have some other staff members. You may have someone that does a lot with recreation or planning, and you may even schedule them, some of those in there. You may have some other volunteer staff in that meeting. A couple other things that are mentioned in your notes are even some key students, the pastor with his planning sessions. And you need to think about what are the strengths and weaknesses of having each of those individuals in there. Step two, as we move through, you need to pray and conduct a ministry forecast. Okay, pray and conduct a ministry forecast. We just talked about that earlier. Step 3, you're going to move through and you're going to study all relevant calendars. You're going to look at the church calendar, the Christian school, the public school. Look at the national holiday calendars, the community calendars for festivals and special things that you may want to be a part of and use for outreach. Look at your personal workers calendars, your volunteers. Look at last year's student ministry calendar. And see how get all of that together so you have those key dates there. Then step 4. Step 4 is very simple. Record all regular and confirmed series programs. In other words, all your Sunday programs. If you have regular Wednesday programs, or if you have ministry team training during the week, or if there are monthly things that happen. Every single month there's something that is scheduled, whether it's a leadership meeting or whether it's some type of an event or program. Record all your confirmed series and programs so everyone can know we're staying away from those areas. Then number 5 is conduct that brainstorming session. With that brainstorming session, you need to list dozens of potential programs. You find resource books, websites, history of your youth ministry. Do a survey of your students. Ask them about successes and determine which ones were failures and maybe some new activities that should be tried or programs. Maybe even resource other student ministries. Step 6 is where you compose a tentative list. And in that, you need to balance in purpose, finances, time, intensity, resources, all of the above. The rule of thumb is you want to look at 4 to 6 major programs a year and 10 to 12 minor ones. Once again, you're looking at what has been successful in the past, what hasn't worked in the past, what are some new things that we need to try. And then we get down to, before we get into step 7, I want to throw out just a caution. You need to beware of several syndromes that can happen as you're doing this planning, especially when someone gets in the mode of brainstorming and thinking of ideas. Beware of spiraling, where from year to year you think about bigger and better activities, improving the excellence and the intentionality of something, and the uniqueness of it is one thing, but just trying to outdo for the sake of being bigger or better is a very dangerous thing. Second is numbing. where you have too many big ideas. You're going to lose people quickly. It is the small things that you do in your student ministry well on a consistent basis that usually brings about the greatest life transformation in the lives of your students. And then number three is burdening, where you just have too many activities. And you lose interest of students and families, and they can't even keep up. In this climate, in this culture that we live in, there are multiple things vying for every family's time. And so you need to be careful with burdening them with those things. Then we move into step 7, 8, 9, and 10. Step 7 is simply to complete a program proposal planning sheet for every program that you are laying out on your calendar, every single one of them. It's similar to what you're doing for your project that's coming up that's due this week. You need to complete one of those for every single one. Step 8 is to confirm the calendar. Meet with the pastor. If you're in a smaller church context, the church administrator, um, um, the executive pastor, a committee, your elders, whoever's in charge of that. Follow-up meeting. Do a follow-up meeting with your volunteer staff, and then record everything on the church calendar. Then the final two steps is to complete a production schedule for every program. I know some of you felt overwhelmed and you looked at that spreadsheet and you weren't sure really what it was supposed to look like, but it's really detailing every single step in the process of executing that program. Step 10 is to publish the calendar. Announce it to your course students, send it to staff, volunteers, parents quarterly. That may be in print or it may be an email, or make sure it's on your website. Use email and social media to your advantage. Tweet events on a regular basis. And then remember that last statement. One and done promotion only results in done, not done well. You need to have multiple hits and promotional material out there to make sure that you get full participation and that you get complete buy-in. Some last thoughts just before we wrap this one up. Be ready for a plan B. It's critical, and I apologize for that Microsoft Windows window that keeps popping up there. I'm not sure what that's for, but be ready for plan B or to start from scratch. And then finally, know the specific calendar planning system for your church and become the expert, so you can become a resource and not necessarily a headache for those that are in administrative roles. Well, I hope you guys have a great week, and I know that your deadline is coming up here in a couple of days. So this will be posted here shortly. And I hope you guys, if you have any questions, just hit me up on the Ask the Professor link on the Moodle page. And we will have Chapter 3 up ready to go this weekend, and should be up by Monday. We'll talk to you later.